Hello, all. My name is Luke Kassab, current sophomore at the University of Michigan studying sport management, and this is my Education 335 Innovation Project. As you can see by the photo, I'm a huge women's basketball fan, but a women's sports fan in general. And I believe that they're underappreciated for the time they put in, the effort, and the amount of work that they put in along with their skill. Women's college basketball has grown rapidly over the last couple of years. They've had record-breaking viewership, attendance, and media attention, but somehow the growth hasn't turned into anything. There's no consistent investment, and this growth, while it's continuing to happen, is not getting rewarded. Let's set the stage. It's 2021, it's March Madness, and you open your phone and see two different weight rooms. On the top, you have a weight room full of any type of equipment you needed and tons of room. On the bottom, you see a couple of sanitized yoga mats and a couple of dumbbells. On the top, you have the men's March Madness tournaments weight room. And on the bottom, you have the women's. Because they were in a quarantine, this is what they had to operate with the entirety of the tournament. You see a clear disparity between the way that the NCAA sees the men's teams and the women's teams, but also their tournaments. And the worst part of all of this is that the NCAA didn't acknowledge that this was an issue until superstar athletes such as Steph Curry came out and said something about it. Steph tweeted, "Wow, come on now. March Madness, NCAA, y'all tripping." Just showing the disrespect that he even feels as a professional athlete with the disparity between the two locker rooms. My innovation project is a proposal for the women's basketball revenue reinvestment requirement. So the WBRRR would require 20%, 25% of the revenue that women's basketball teams at each school make goes right back into their program. Women's basketball is one of three collegiate sports that makes a profit along with football and men's basketball. And I believe that their revenue should go directly back into their program. Revenue could include ticket sales, media rights, sponsorships, postseason earnings, conference earnings, and tournament earnings. And the tournament earnings is the big one because as of 2025, the women's March Madness tournament now gives funds by round, similarly to the way that the men's tournament does. So their tournament earnings, and for 2026, it was 25 million was up for grabs in the tournament for schools, but also their conferences. And then out of this 25%, I believe that it should be reinvested into facilities, travel, athlete services, recruiting, marketing, or wherever the head coach, GM, and athletic director see fit to ensure that their program is maximizing its potential. On the bottom here, you see the rapid growth that women's basketball has had. And in 2018, it was 3.6 million viewers, whereas in 2024, it was 18.9 million viewers. An insane, almost six times increase. And 2023 is the big year we'll talk about because that marks the 41-year gap between the first women's basketball tournament and Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese's. Similarly, this is very much like the men's tournament and the growth of men's college basketball, where it took 41 years between the first tournament and the Bird versus Magic Johnson tournament in 1979, which sparked a love for basketball. And then 2026 March Madness, just in case you need a little more persuading that the stats and the viewership increase is real. 2026 tournament saw the third most watched women's national championship ever and a 15% increase from the national championship the year prior with UConn and South Carolina. And then this tournament as a whole was the second most watched NCAA tournament ever, only behind 2024. And the Final Four was the second most watched of all time on the ESPN networks. And big thing here is ESPN bought the rights in 2024 to women's March Madness. And in doing so, that 10 years, $980 million deal led to a growth in fandom of women's basketball, but also more airtime and publication for the sport, which has increased viewership. So, as shown in the pie chart here, the WBRRRR will have an athletic department recoup 75% of the funds that are made and the revenue, whereas 25% is reinvested into the sport. As mentioned, women's basketball is one of three revenue sports in the collegiate world, and if they continue to improve and grow, So I believe that they benefit their athletic departments and specific schools, but they also deserve to be benefiting from their own growth. So for the WB, for my plan to be implemented and successful, it needs to be implemented at a conference level. So if you're a Big Ten school, the Big Ten overlooks you, the SEC overlooks the SEC schools, etc. And schools will submit an annual revenue and reinvestment report. So it shows the revenue based on the characteristics we described above, with a heavy emphasis on the actual tournament earnings now, because that's where the bulk of money is going to come from. And in doing so, your annual audited reports will include your revenue generated and the amount reinvested, and you're going to be evaluated for it. So the conference is going to review you, and also a third party audit will review your reported numbers to ensure that both align. And if that is not the case, there's going to be a penalty for non-compliance, which could be seen as a fine, reduced payouts, restrictions on future NIL or revenue sharing, as well as potential suspensions for your head coach and GM. And then finally, revenues cross-checked against all aspects defined as revenue. So because of that, you're going to have both sides. You're going to have what we consider revenue and what the NCAA considers revenue. This is all Title IX inspired, and Title IX ensures equal opportunity, but not equal reinvestment. So this policy builds on that by ensuring financial growth translates into real support for the women's teams. So some risks and challenges that come with this are prevalent. There's many schools that try to keep their profit and loss close to zero. So because of that, there's an increase in budget pressure and trade-offs for other sports. School like Michigan does a very good job of keeping its profit and loss at zero. So this means that they're going to have to reevaluate their strategy. And because of the 25% being mandatory, they're going to have to cut some other type of sport. And in order to comply with Title IX as well, they're going to have to ensure that it's equal cutting between men's and women's sports. Secondly, because the revenue is often reinvested back into their actual programs, it means that it's just strategic changes. So it may be less money going towards football, or it may be less money going towards the field hockey team. All of which just means that there's going to be more resources for the women's basketball program and a higher accountability and responsibility for the athletic departments to handle. And athletic departments obviously do have a tight budget, so it creates a pressure on them unlike any other, but it may actually assist us in the overall spending of athletic departments on their particular programs. And finally, some smaller schools may struggle to implement this consistently, and we understand that because they already are struggling to go and tie and approve the NIL guidelines right now. So we understand that, and we just know that it's going to be a struggle initially, but it's going to help them financially and be more responsible with their athletic money. So my two expert interviews for this were Silas Swords, a current member of the Michigan women's basketball team, who has played post Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, and Justin Gendler, who works for the Pistons, but was also a key part of the Detroit WNBA expansion bid. So let's start with Sila.
So I'm doing for my project in this class, I'm talking about how women's sports and in particular women's basketball has grown in the past few years. So what would you say the biggest differences have been in regards to your freshman year versus now in regards to facilities, different types of revenue sharing models? What has really been big changes that happen?
A lot, right?
Yeah. Freshman year, we just got a new locker room, which our old locker room, I don't know how old it was, maybe 30 or 40 years old, and we just got that last year. Whereas I know the football team has the bowling alley and maybe you've heard of movie theater, all this stuff. Like they have a lot of stuff, and it just took us, like we just got fresh showers. We couldn't even shower in our showers because they were so disgusting. But again, I'm saying that on the optimistic side to say that, we're developing a lot. We're getting a lot more. Our revenue sharing has stayed the same these past 2 years, but they have gotten more money out of other deals, other companies within Michigan who are really leaning into support women's sports. So I think that the viewership has been progressively getting bigger. And I think it's at this point where companies are starting to jump in to give more contracts.
Absolutely. All right.
So as Sila mentioned here, big thing is more brands are beginning to invest in women's basketball because of the growth. So as more brands continue to invest, it means more money is being put in naturally. But one thing that she said is the new showers. That's something that stood out to me. As we know, a football program, a men's basketball program, they're constantly updating and improving their locker rooms and facilities to ensure that the best recruits come to their school and are impressed by their facilities. The women's team just got a new locker room. They just got a shower. It's the first time that they can actually shower in their locker room. So this by itself shows a disparity between the two, but it also shows them getting closer to one another because while the women's team may not have a bowling alley or a barber within their facility and in their locker rooms, they are beginning to become more even to that of the men's teams. But also because of this investment, they're continuing to get more and more towards their programs. Then, secondly, Michigan is kinder with their revenue sharing towards their players, and that's where we're hoping that all schools are going to get. Okay, second interview. Totally real picture here of me and Justin Kendler outside of the IM. But unfortunately, Justin was not able to speak and be recorded, but we did speak on the phone between a speaker event he had and Pistons game which he had to work. So we had a 15-minute conversation, and let's get into that. So as mentioned, key part of Gendler is he was vital for the WNBA negotiation and actually wrote the bid. So that led me to ask him from his perspective what made some of the major investors confident in the Detroit expansion and what he had to do to convince them, and also the challenges that he faced with writing the actual bid. So to begin with, his key investors, Illich family, Grant Hill, Chris Webber, just a lot of basketball identity. And then we know with the Illiches, they're very for women's sports, as seen through the fact that they're vouching and willing to put some funds into a women's hockey team if that ever happened. But he actually said that the investors didn't need any convincing because of the success of the Shock in the late 90s and early 2000s. That was Detroit's former WNBA team. They were successful, the fans were engaged, and they were ahead of the curve. So the investors knew that if they put the time in and the effort in, they were going to get a good product. Then, in regards to the challenges, he said the convincing of investors, as stated, was not a challenge which surprised me, but it also shows the growth of women's basketball as a whole. But he said rather the uniqueness of the bid and the traits that came with it were really what were challenges. Detroit was battling with a lot of other cities for this spot, and they all were willing to put as much money into it as they had to. So what ended up getting Detroit the bid was the fact that they're going to have a new practice facility that opens for exclusively the women's team because they will be playing in Little Caesars, and also the youth engagement opportunities that are going to be tied to the WNBA team. A big thing that they're going to be built on is engaging the youth and educating them on women's sports early on. So this is something that was huge for their bid. Then as well, I talked to him about his time at the University of Michigan because he was an alum and how the commercial value of women's basketball has changed since he graduated, but also since he finished the bid and how that's affected the bid. So he mentioned in 2021, his senior year, the women's basketball team actually made the Sweet 16, but they couldn't fill a stadium. And then you compare it to now, where we hosted the first two rounds of the tournament this year, and there was a lot of engagement for an Elite Eight team at the University of Michigan. He said it's clear differences between the engagement level of students, which is huge for their success. He also cited the rise of Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark, which we spoke about, which that as a whole drew more love to women's basketball. Then I also asked him if he believed the sustained investment at the college level is essential for the long-term growth of the professional women's game and how my proposal would affect the women's basketball and WNBA setting. So to begin with, he said there's a symbiotic relationship between the WNBA and the NCAA. The WNBA gets the NCAA's players. So they're really training both on the court, but also media training these players while also being a fan development and talent pipeline for them. So with increased funding towards women's basketball, we're going to have an improved product. And it's also going to allow for more players to have a love drawn to them by the fans. If we have more of an emphasis on women's basketball and more growth, we're going to see more players who are universally loved, like Paige Beckers, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, AZ Fudd, who just got drafted, when they're coming into the league, which automatically helps the WNBA. And then, secondly, he said with the draft rules, this is something he highlighted. Our change actually benefits the draft because of what I said prior, but also because their rules right now are that you have to be 22 years old or graduated. So we're not creating an incentive to stay in school for longer. Rather, we're improving the school experience before they get to the dub. Finally, stakeholder analysis. There are four big ones. I would say that a positive stakeholder analysis would be female basketball players because they're benefiting from improved travel conditions, expanded staffing, upgraded facilities, enhanced training resources, and they have a more stable fund. So they know that there's going to be increased competitiveness, but also the funding is needed. So they're in a safer spot. Athletic directors are initially going to see this as a negative, then switch to a positive because they're going to feel restricted and immediately with the change to revenue. But once they get it down, it's going to improve their efficiency with their money, but also it's going to create an identity for their women's program, which in the long run could improve their product. Coaches see it as a positive. They're seen as equals to men's coaches, and their programs can finally establish an identity. And in doing so, find better recruits and do a better job of player development. And finally, boosters, donors, and collectives will be mixed with their opinions because initially they're going to think that it's taking resources away from men's basketball and football. But actually, what it's doing is creating a culture that's going to allow for more success and more opportunities for collectives to make money and boosters to feel involved. In conclusion, women's basketball's growth is undeniable, and the WBRRRR is the first step towards further success and equality. Thank you.